Well, this should not come as a surprise. This should really not come as a surprise at all, because this is what the Brexiteers said that they would do. And are we shocked that they actually went out and did something so monumentally stupid? And of course, the EU would rebuke them for it. And remember, these changes are coming down the line in October, and yet not even the EU knows how these new Tom checks are going to work because the government has not told them how it is going to work. You see, every time I say these changes are going to be kicked down the can for another year, I genuinely do not think anyone has a clue, an absolute clue what is going on here. I really do. I really do think that there is no planning, no clue whatsoever over something that is incredibly important, because this is going to grind all UK trade and stuff coming in from the EU to a complete halt. This is going to cause unbridled chaos, the type of which we have been talking about on this channel for years. And bear in mind, we're getting at the moment those big summer Brexit queues down at the border, as we have every single year. It's become a rolling thing, just as we predicted. Surprise, surprise. But now we have some new shocking news coming out that the UK tried to bypass the EU. As I said, should we be shocked? No, because this is what the Brexiteers said that they would do. They would just ignore the EU, as if they could just go ahead and do these things. But anyway, let's find out what happened here, because this is just so dumb. This is just so stupid, but I am not shocked. I really am not shocked, to be honest. Nothing shocks me about Brexit except the just sheer stupidity on display. But before we do get into that, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. Down below, there are links to the Patreon page, the one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee, the YouTube thank you button, and of course the Patreon page as well, and the YouTube Pony Club too. So let's crack on into this. But whew, boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Is there some real Brexit stupidity on display today? So this was all brought out by The Independent just yesterday, with the title of "Brussels Tells the EU States to Ignore the UK on Post-Brexit Trade." So the EU has slapped down the UK government after it attempted to bypass Brussels on post-Brexit trade rules. Should we be shocked? Absolutely not. But all this happened under apparently Boris Johnson's government, and how they've went about this. So we'll find out more, I'm sure, in the coming days. So documents obtained by The Independent show that the European Commission wasn't happy after the British officials asked each member state directly about their plans to cope with the new checks on goods coming into the UK. At one point, the Commission told countries in the bloc to ignore the UK government completely, and it sent a memo telling member states to provide only short general information because of the problematic nature of the British request. The Commission later warned that the UK that contacting each country was directly was outside the terms of Boris Johnson's Brexit trade deal, saying that it was a significantly concern since the proper response to British queries should be harmonised at an EU level. The rebuke has emerged after Rishi Sunak's government came under pressure from both the EU and British bosses to spell out exactly how the latest controls on imports are due to come into force in October will work. Peter Mendelsohn, the former business secretary who served as the EU Trade Commission from 2024 to 2018, said that trying to circumnavigate Brussels was always going to backfire. He said to The Independent, "It's tempting to try and go round the Commission, but this does not work. It is counterproductive. The British government should be doubling down on a good relationship with the Commission and building trust. Britain desperately needs this in order to mitigate our losses in trade." Trade experts have also said that it's been unwise to try and go around the Brussels chiefs, as it was still indicative of a still struggling relationship ahead of another mountain of red tape for businesses across the continent to try and navigate. One food industry expert said in the memos that were showed the unhelpful friction between the UK and the EU at a time when they should be working together to avoid major disruption later this year. So this is just the sheer this is really just the sheer madness of this, because I had hoped that when Rishi Sunak got into office, there really seemed to be a genuine change in how Rishi Sunak was going to handle UK EU relations, that they were going to be a lot warmer than frostier. And that's not, of course, because of David Frost. And certainly under Boris Johnson's government and Liz Truss, we saw this attitude of we can just ignore the EU. We're not interested in talking to them. Of course, there was the infamous quote from, I think, Boris Johnson at the time, that they're not interested in talking with the EU or having any talks with them until 2022. So they went for years refusing to talk to the EU. But Rishi Sunak comes in, does the Windsor Agreement, a very, very much a good step in the right direction for sort of UK EU relations to go in. We see recently two big climb downs by the UK government. First of all, the getting rid of the sunset clause, keeping a lot of EU sort of retained law, which is very good because we need that for, harmonization processes. Kimi Badenoch saying, "I'm going to refuse to do that because it's not a good idea." We've seen recently, just yesterday, in fact, the keeping indefinitely of the European safety mark. Things were on the right track, and now we've got this. And so, how on earth did this all happen? Well, from what we can see of some of these stories, it comes down to the fact that all these checks are going to be coming in October, just as they've tried every year, kicking the can down the road again and again and again. And I keep on saying it's very likely these checks are going to be mooted on ahead for yet another year. I really do think that, because you see some of the things, the requests from this, because even they have no idea how to actually do this. You think these checks are coming into force in October, and yet food industry bosses still have no idea how these checks are going to work. They've got no clue how this is going to work. And even the system itself, I suspect that this new Tom system and the IT systems in place, I don't think they are either ready or potentially up to the challenge of trying to handle the sheer volume that it is going to be hit with. I really don't think it's up to the challenge, because we've seen that a couple of times before when we've talked about these types of systems in place at the border. But we're just going to jump ahead. Where is it? So here it is. So this is where you get to a comment by David Heggie, where he has to say about this. So David Heggie, the director at the European Centre for International Political Economy, said that UK officials should have known that the Brussels coordinated member states' responses to avoid any partial disruptions on Brexit issues. The Brexit expert had this to say: "It looks unwise for the UK to have approached this issue this way, something that could damage the trust that we need." Mr. Heggie added that the row was just symbolic of a still struggling relationship, and it's added more friction that we do not need. Dr. Kirsty Hughes, the director of the Scottish Centre on European Relations, said that the memos appear to show that the EU is implicitly advising member states that if they give the unintentional impression that they are fully ready, then the UK might use that to blame them if there is disruption. So this is what is seen to have gone on here, that these memos that they've obtained, one has come from the UK government saying, so how are you going to handle all our new changes? Are you ready for them? And then the EU's had to come in and go, okay, guys, this email seems really, really, as it was said at the top there, problematic, because if one of you replies that you're ready and ready to go, when in actual fact you're not, because the UK government still has not told the EU or anyone how these new operating systems are going to work, which, bear in mind, I want to remind you, coming in October, we still don't know how they're going to work. It is going to be a disaster. 110% a absolute disaster. The only thing that is going to save this is if they boot this down the road for yet another year. But still, every single time we've come up to this deadline, the exact same thing has happened. The UK is generally not ready to actually put these checks in place. The systems of how we actually going to do these checks are not in place. We spent thousands of pounds, billions indeed, on building these new these new port systems to do all these checks that are needed and are necessary, and yet they haven't brought them in. These massive warehouses built for these places for this exact reason have not been operational. They've just sat empty for the past 2 to 3 years. And it has been a colossal waste in money, where we've seen local authorities, Portsmouth in particular, try to go to the UK government and said, hey, we built this massive facility that's been standing empty for a couple of years, and we haven't been able to recoup losses because obviously when it's operating, it would generate money, but instead it's just sat empty for all this time. Can you give us some money to compensate for this until, you actually start running these things? It's honestly insane, the level of unreadiness that has gone on here, and something that should be so important, that should have been ready and looked at. And of course, who it is here, it's these two guys' fault here, Boris Johnson and Frost's fault, because they had no idea over this. But David Davis, the original Brexit secretary, had this to chime in when he had to say about this. He said, this is going to happen from time to time, and again in coming years. Good diplomacy tries to understand the person you are negotiating with or dealing with, always. So you are always going to run into this. And the Commission, for its part, perfectly properly, is always going to try and maintain a common front. That is why it comes out. That's what comes out of these things. It certainly isn't the first time, and it certainly won't be the last time this happens, I'm sure. If it's ever the way that the EU is always suspicious of any attempt to talk directly to its member states. Recalling even his own experience during negotiations, Frost told The Independent, at the time, they were always suspicious that we were going to try and undermine their common position, which we weren't. Which wasn't true, because you had David Davis going around in UK papers as if people in the EU or the EU wouldn't read, the UK media, saying that, we're going to do individual deals with EU member states. And you wonder why he's saying, oh, yeah, the EU might be suspicious of us. Undermine their competition, which we weren't. We were just simply trying to find out what the priorities of different member states were. Yeah, we were just trying to find out what the different positions of these different member states were, so we could try and undermine your common negotiating position. But Malcolm Redkin said that the EU is probably correct, but the Commission should not be so bureaucratic about it. Trade is an EU responsibility, not the responsibility of individual member states. So, to be strictly correct, the proper communication should be with the EU and the people responsible for trade. Adding, they could have treated it a bit more lightly. It's not exactly a capital offence, but you went against their rules. You went against their rules. And one of the big things the EU has constantly said since the very beginning of Brexit, since 2016, has been, okay, you've triggered this, you want to leave, fine. But you've got to follow the rules to leave, which again, we balked at and said, we don't have to follow your rules. And then the EU went, no, actually, you have to follow the rules. And then we did follow the rules. Then afterwards, multiple times under Boris Johnson saying, we're not going to follow the rules. We're not going to follow the rules. And then the EU turned around and said, oh, yes, you are going to follow the rules. And now we have another situation which has come really at a bad time, of where there was seemingly a gradual warming of relations. And this is where we have to get the Conservatives out, because the EU is not going to be very trustful of this continuing Tory government, and something that when Starmer gets in, he's going to actually have to show the EU that there is some honesty, some rebuilding of these bridges, which we were doing slowly and that have now seemed to have fallen apart. So thank you very much, Rishi Sunak, for once again showing just how foolish this whole thing really was. But of course, John Redwood has come into here, saying that the EU is in the EU's interest to take a more conciliatory approach, saying that the EU seems to be set on being unfriendly when it should be much more sensible for them to be cooperative, as they export a lot more to us than we export to them, he said. Not true. I think the EU should understand that we voted to leave. They shouldn't treat us as if we're still in the thing. We want to be free of their jurisdiction, and we will make our own way in the world. I think Britain should do whatever it wants to do. Except that's not how it works. Just because you are a sovereign country does not mean you can go and just start upsetting anyone else's sovereignty. And the thing is, we said we were going to follow your rules. Everyone else around the world follows these rules. This has been the continuing thing that the EU has been worried about, that we are not going to follow these different these rules. And so it's going to make negotiations and things like standardizations a lot harder, because now the EU is probably thinking, if we did a deal like an alignment deal with this government, would the UK government follow it? This current UK government isn't really setting very high standards when it comes to this relationship between us two. And yet you have, of course, big Brexiteer guys saying, oh, well, they export far more to us than we export to them. Again, not true. Brexiteers will always trot out the whole, it's only 46% of our trade we send to the EU. Meanwhile, when you look at the actual industries, you see 50, 60%, 70% in some cases of manufactured goods. And as we said before, this doesn't include services. A lot of our services are very much involved in the EU, of course, not included in that 46%, because the Brexiteers only used goods, not services, in that regard. But hey, there you go. But then a fellow Brexit backer, Craig McKinley, decided to jump in and defend them, saying that the UK is the single biggest and most profitable trading partner for many EU countries. As we introduce reciprocal border checks for imports, it is reasonable for DEFRA and the Department for Business and Trade to wish to make future trade seamless as possible. Hence their approach to EU countries directly. Why to these EU countries? Why not to the EU Commission? This missive sent by the EU Commission to its member states serves as an example of the absolute control that it wishes to exert across its empire. Again, it is not an empire. The EU is set up to operate in such a way that if you are going to do trade, which is pretty much the function really of the EU, then you should be talking to the EU Commission and its bodies in around the EU, not going and asking individual member states, because all of a sudden, as was pointed out above, well, if anything does go wrong, they can start blaming either these individual European countries or just start blaming the EU, saying, well, you said you were ready. You were clearly not. But Jacob Rees-Mogg also decides to jump in, saying this, that this is just a storm in a teacup. I don't think we should be imposing these controls at all. Of course he does, because remember, he's a free market fundamentalist. As far as he's concerned, these tariffs should be set to zero, and there should be just free flowing. There should be no checks, no regulation whatsoever. As we've said many times, that would be an absolutely terrible idea. But he continued, I managed, when I was the Brexit Opportunities Minister, to delay them because they were purely imposed costs on British consumers for no real advantage. How about the safety, security, and the checking of what you've got to have of what's coming into your country? You know, to make sure that these goods are fit for sale, that what is in these lorries is actually what is on the paperwork. It's just so many reasons why you should be on these checks, and yet you're not. Oh, and this guy was once considered to be a really intelligent person and a really good politician, and yet one of the things that's been the good parts of Brexit is the absolute demolition of this image that Mogg put forward. He continued to say, it seems to be a protectionist measure designed to make trade more difficult and not in the interests of the UK economy. I wouldn't bother with these checks. They're pointless. And in an inflationary time, a cost to British consumers that we could do without. Meanwhile, Britain's food and logistics leaders have warned of the coming wave of post-Brexit red tape could cause disruption and worsen the inflation crisis by pushing up food prices at the supermarket. And yet, I've said before, we need these checks. We have seen an increase in smuggling at the border. There was the incident of over 12 loads of suspicious meat that was stopped from entering into the UK supply chain. You need these checks, but of course, to people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, he doesn't care. Because he's a complete deregulationist. There should be no checks. There should be a tip of the hat as the lorry crosses the border, but that's about it. And this is why these idiots, if they had been honest, if they had been open and honest about what they wanted to do during Brexit and the referendum, no one would have voted for them. They would have been seen for the absolute lunatics that they are being seen for now. But Shane Brennan, we've talked about him before. He's obviously comes up in these conversations. He had this to say. He warned that there was still a lot of unhelpful uncertainty and confusion among the European businesses about the certificates that they will need and how these border controls will actually operate. They're not confident it will go smoothly, he said. He also said that the unhelpful friction had come at a time when the UK businesses and ports chiefs are livid that they do not have enough information from the government about how these import checks are supposed to work, saying there is going to be a period of disruption and paralysis, he said to The Independent. There's so many unanswered questions, and yet again, we're going to have to deal with them when it comes. It is a complete mess. And that scares me. That scares me for the fact that you have someone who is such a high position dealing with this, in food supply, And he's saying that it is going to be a complete mess of a period of disruption and paralysis. That's terrifying. That should be worrying. But Mr. Brennan said that it still isn't exactly clear what types of food and agricultural goods will fall into the low, medium, and high risk categories, each of which demands a different set of controls. Although DEFRA has provided outlines as part of the TOM operating model, he said that this still wasn't yet clear with what digital forms would have to be uploaded to the British government's website from the 31st of October. And given that the autumn start date was supposed to represent a soft launch, and some of the physical inspections won't begin until January. An EU official had this to say: it is up to the UK to draw up the whole workable import regime, taking into account the significant volume of exports from the EU to the UK. Nevertheless, the Commission is in close contact with the UK authorities and its member states in order to try and understand the consequences and requirements from the future implementation of the border targeting operating model for the EU. And here's what's going to happen. Here's what's going to happen. Two things are going to happen. Either A, they skip it. They just kick it down the road for another year. They just say, oh, it's not ready. Or they use the Jacob Rees-Mogg excuse of these costs are too great. Well, why do Brexit? Because we were always going to have to do this, you know? We said this from day one. If you do this, you're going to have to bring all these checks. And people like Jacob Rees-Mogg said, no, that's not going to happen because we're not going to leave the single market and customs union. I've said it before. Any future prime minister, I think, could just rejoin the single market and customs union. And the Brexiteers could throw a hissy fit all they want. He could just turn around and say, well, we're fulfilling the will of the people. Leave said, we're going to, remain in the single market customs union. And Kimmy Badenoch has said, again, joining the Pacific Partnership, we can join any trade bloc we want without a referendum. So 6 months notice to the Pacific Partnership, start negotiations to join the single market customs union, get that sorted out, learn when the start date is, send the 6 months notice, leave the Pacific Partnership, join the single market customs union. Job done. Sign an alignment bill, which would be easy to pass, to be honest, saying that the UK will align with the regulations that the EU makes. It's that simple. It really is. Well, I say it's simple. It's not. Of course, there's going to be a lot of negotiations and stuff that go on, but it is doable. It is very doable. But sooner or later, they have to bring in these checks. It doesn't matter that they keep on kicking this down the road, because every time they do, they just go to show how unworkable their grand project is, and that they had no idea how to implement this. Because you go back to Brexit and the sort of the post-referendum years, and it's like you've got Jacob Rees-Mogg saying that how we can have this fantastic digital border which does not exist anywhere in the world, and that physical checks are always needed and required at borders. And yet they lived in this Blade Runner Looney Tunes fantasy of this free market fundamentalist belief. And yet now it's all coming home to roost. They had no idea. They've got to put in these checks sooner or later, and that will cause massive disruption. It will lead to a massive increase in costs. They know the public are not going to be happy. And then that's when they turn around, because we're already seeing an increase in, in wanting to reverse Brexit. The British public is not going to be happy, especially at a time of mass inflation, when these costs could be increased as well. Not only just the food costs, but of course inflation as well. And the other knock-on effects it's going to have on tons of different businesses as well. This is a walking disaster. This is an absolute walking disaster zone. And I will say it now. they are going to have to knock these checks on forward for a year. They're going to have to. And if they do, well, they accept all this chaos. And what's to blame? It's not the EU. It's not these different individual European countries. It's Brexit. It's your precious Brexit that is to blame here. Nothing else. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.